Right, good morning. Thanks for starting the new year at Horizon. My name is John Kirby. I'm the Connections Pastor at Horizon, and I want to invite Dick and Ann Satterfield up. These 10 weeks, we're, as a church, looking at the Gospel of Luke, and we're calling it Startup. So we thought it would be kind of interesting to look at the startup of Horizon, and Dick and Ann are actually part of the plant team that helped to start Horizon. Now, today's like our anniversary of our first service here in this building was January 2011. Our public launch was Easter, April 15th of 2001. So we're talking, 17 years ago? But you guys were there before then. You guys were in the beginning before the beginning. So tell me how you got called in the late 90s, I think it was, to be a part of Horizon.
Yeah, it was 1999. Actually, it was one of those moments where you can look back and say, God's timing is perfect, and oftentimes I don't see that, and yet we know that it is. Maybe we'll find out in heaven. But that particular case, it was Easter of 99. We're going to a church that we loved. We loved the people. We loved the pastor. And that particular Easter Sunday, we were in the service, and I kept falling asleep. I didn't know what was wrong. I loved the service. I loved the pastor. I couldn't figure out why I kept falling asleep.
Now, we think might have been that we had 2-year-old triplets. In fact, 2 of the triplets are not 2 anymore. They're over there. One of them is about 6'6". And
they still keep you awake and lose sleep.
They still keep us awake, though.
He was convinced that was the reason I was falling asleep. But God kept urging me that, while this is a wonderful church, we're supposed to take what we have that's so important to us, our faith, and share it with others and invite them in a nice, comfortable way that they can grow in their faith. And so I kept telling Dick this over and over again for the next month, which he kept thinking, I'm just, lack of sleep, you have triplets, it'll go away, don't worry.
So I got a phone call from actually a high school friend of Ann's, and he laid out this vision for this new church that he wanted to start on the east side of Cincinnati here, and it was designed to reach those people who had kind of become disenfranchised with church. So he was really a talkative guy, so I'm listening, and he's laying out this vision. At the end of it, he said, I'd like you and Ann to pray about whether you'd like to be involved as part of this plant. So I got off the phone, and Ann said, who is that? And I told her who it was, and she said, what's he talking about? And I laid it out for Ann, and Ann said, well, do you want to pray about it? I said, we don't need to pray about it. Now, you got to listen to this carefully. I said, we're really happy. And she said to me, we're really happy, or you're really happy?
Yeah.
And so you know the rest of the story.
Compromise.
No, we prayed about it, and you finally got there, but he was a little slow. But I will tell you, I do think that in every sacrifice, God always rewards you. And our closest friends, both of us, are the people that were on the plant team and the people now here at this church. So it was clear. But what was really interesting about the thing was the next night, then the gentleman came over and did a gift, or I guess next week, did a gift assessment test to figure out where our skills might match to help the church out.
So lots of questions that you answered, like on
tons.
paper.
I mean, it took like an hour and a half.
Okay.
And then the next night he showed up and shared what he felt that we should be appropriately fitted for, and he wanted me to be the initial marketing team and then on the executive board.
Right, which you've served on for years.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't you interested in what they wanted me to
do? Yeah, what about you, Dick?
Okay. So remember, we were doing these in high schools, and so part of what you had to do was you had to make sure that the classrooms looked the same after the Sunday school class. They called that the breakdown team.
So I have to say, I thought his job would be much bigger, but he seemed to really like it. And actually, when we moved in here, you still say you missed the breakdown team.
I missed the breakdown team.
So we had to schlep in these 6 foot tall, 6 foot long, 2 foot wide black bins, rolling bins. We went to Country Day. We had to keep all our stuff in the parking lot, move it in the ice and the cold, like a day like today. We had to move it in.
This was a tough day today.
Set up all the chairs. So you were part of that glorious team.
Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome.
God used my talents.
So I had kind of heard about the church and heard, well, you can't visit it. That was before it went public. I was like, what do you mean you can't visit it? But before you went public, no one was allowed to come. You had like a goal of getting like maybe 125 people, I understand now. Before you launched, you were trying to come up with a name. But tell us about the early days, how you came up with the name and the vision and the culture.
Well, what was really interesting was at the very beginning, when there were probably about 25 of us, we would start meeting at the Founder's House for church. And we had this makeshift children's program, and we'd have praise and worship, and Kenny would be there, and it was incredible.
Kenny with the long hair down to his...
Yes,
yeah,
I don't know if they're showing those pictures, but yes, he's had a drastic haircut since then.
Yeah.
And then we ended up, at that 25, we then rented Indian Hill High School. And our goal was to get approximately an additional 100 people so that we'd have enough manpower to open the doors and have people out in the parking lot and the greeting team and the children's program and all that. So at that point, we started inviting other people whose faith was important to them, that they would also be interested in being a part of this. But other people who weren't involved in church but would like to go to the church, ultimately, we kept saying, we're so excited, we have to wait till we do the grand opening. This will be great.
Right. And you weren't allowed to invite anybody who was active at another church to the grand opening. You did all personal invitations. And
Yes.
My draw to come to Horizon was, I was at a church where most of the people already believed. And I heard that like half the people you had were like, hadn't been to church in 20 years. So I was like, how did you make a priority to make them feel welcome? How did that work to get them here in the first place and to make them want to come back the second week?
Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah.
Okay. So
She's on the executive board.
No. So we, from the very beginning, we felt that this is God's church. This isn't our church, and that we wanted it to be inviting, not exclusive. So we did a market research study initially at the very beginning where we hired a company that called 250 families in the Marymount Terrace Park and Indian Hill area to try to figure out why are people not going to church, or why did they go and they're not going anymore. And it was really revealing. I mean, it showed more times than not it was an individual, or it was the church itself that had them turn off against religion, or maybe they've never gone because their family never went. And what were those things, those stumbling blocks that caused them not to? And today, the programming, the building, everything you touch here is almost a direct reflection from that market research study that hopefully helps you to feel comfortable in exploring your faith.
Yeah, and I know part of the tension that we continue with today is people always want to say, okay, but we're here and we've grown, so we want it to be more about us and give us the best time, but we continue to want to try to keep, at least for the 10, 11, 10, there for like somebody who hasn't been to church in 20 years, that neighbor that you were first excited about inviting. And I assume you still have new neighbors now that you invite.
Yes. Well, we even had rules when we were at Country Day before we moved. At Country Day before we moved here, that the plant team would have to park in the least desirable parking lots that were far away, the slots, so that the guests could park closer to the building, and that we would have to sit down in the bottom of the auditorium, which was less desirable, to make it more comfortable. It was everything about making it more comfortable and more attainable for other people. Even the time slot, we gave the 10 o'clock time slot rather than the 8:50 time slot to guests coming to church to make it, and hopefully you feel that way.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. So thank you for coming up and sharing a little bit of that.
Sure.
Dick and Ann, can we thank them? So as I said, we're going through 10 weeks of Luke and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We're looking at Luke's gospel, and God chose Luke to write the gospel. He was a doctor. He came at it from a very kind of scientific, investigative, very detail-oriented, and you really see that as you read Luke's gospel. And ideally, we would have loved to start today with having Luke here, but obviously he wrote this in 60-something AD. But we did the best we can. We'd really like to have Luke hear it from his voice.
Well, greetings. It's good to have you here this morning. I'll be right with you. Grab a seat in the waiting room. Yeah, actually, I'll be with you next. I finished it up, actually. Great. Well, I'm Dr. Luke. Many call me the beloved physician. Where did I do my residency? Well, at the Temple of Asclepius, of course. Here at the Temple of Asclepius, we have temples to Zeus and Apollo and Demeter and Dionysus. But actually, down here in the valley where I did my residency is the actual Temple of Asclepius. You can even visit the ruins today in your modern-day Turkey. We have a sprawling campus, and this is where modern medicine was born. You see, we rejected the Greek religious myth that all sickness was caused by angering the gods requiring sacrifice. We even rejected Plato's view that doctors were supposed to protect the society over the individual. Instead, we practiced Hippocrates' view that the individual mattered. And he had diagnosed and dissected many cadavers to discover how the human body worked. So here on our campus at our sprawling facility, we have a theater at the north corner, where every day our theater teams perform both a comedy and a tragedy. Because we find when people laugh and cry, their body heals itself better. We have a gymnasium. We teach people how to eat right. We teach people how to work their bodies out, to be in shape. And lastly, we experiment with medicines, plants, vegetation, even some bark. In fact, the bark in the trees in this area even today are found to have the components of what you know as modern-day medicine. This is truly where modern medicine was born. In fact, Asclepius, where the temple is built here, you may recognize his staff with the snake coil. That's the symbol of modern doctors and hospitals even today. So I was a man of science, a business owner, and certainly not a believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Jesus. But many of my patients would come in and speak about a different type of God. Unlike our many gods of the Greek Romans, they talked of one God. He was a person, not an energy like the Eastern religions, but this God was always the source of good versus our gods, Zeus and others. They struggled with lust and hatred and self-centeredness, but their God was always the focus and source of goodness. So I began to attend their synagogues, investigating, checking it out, asking questions. In fact, they called me a God-fearer, one who investigates. And I remember learning about Abraham, Isaac, the prophets. And through a many-year study, I began to ask questions. And I became a believer in this God of the Bible. And I would eventually become a believer in the God who sent Jesus. Who would have thought that a man of science, a man who grew up with the myths of Zeus and Apollo, would end up becoming a believer in Jesus? And I got a chance to travel with the Apostle Paul. And I've always been a note taker, very detailed, so I actually got to interview the people he healed, and I had a lot of questions about the healing. I interviewed all of the skeptics, the soldiers, the crowds, the Sanhedrin. I even got a chance to go back and investigate and talk to the shepherds, and even Mary herself. And who would have thought that a Greek, non-Hebrew, man of science would write most of what you know as the New Testament, Luke and eventually Acts. But I have another friend. He's investigating the same journey I've been on. His name is Theophilus. And so I'm writing him an account. And though many have set out to put together an orderly account, a narrative account, because I had a certain awareness of being there, talking to those who had been there, I set out an orderly account for my friend Theophilus that he might know the certainty of the things that happened. See, he wanted to know, who was Jesus, and did he really do the things that people say he did? And how did the Roman Empire get turned upside down? But Jesus had this way of comfortably connecting people to God through the Bible and this community of Christ followers. In the same way that synagogue had taught me of the God of Abraham, where Judaism began with Abraham and Sarah, a barren couple who trusted in God, my account begins in a very similar way. See, Zacharias and Elizabeth, they were barren and they had given up hope of having children. Zacharias was serving as a priest in the temple, and the lot fell to him that day to offer sacrifice in the holy place. As he went in, the crowd I interviewed said that he took longer than normal. They were waiting to get on with worship that day. And eventually he came out and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. And he couldn't speak. So instead he tried to communicate with what you might call charades. You having a baby? And they say he didn't speak for 9 months. But 9 months later, a baby was born to this couple. And they returned to the temple to have him dedicated. And the crowd that was with them, the friends and community, said, "What will you name him? Will you name him the son of Zacharias? Zacharias?" He pulled out a tablet and he wrote, "His name shall be John." And he began to speak again. And he spoke of God appearing to him in the holy place that day and saying that he was going to have a son that was going to be like the pre-launch to the launch. The one preparing for the startup that God had in plan. And his name would be John.